car accidents versus sport injury and why they're not the same thing. And we need to be paying attention to that in our concussion recovery. Let's dive into this episode and learn some more. Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Concussion Nerds podcast. And this month, we're just talking about all the things I haven't talked about lately. And I did a reel about this one, actually. I did a live Instagram live, and then I think I shortened it and did a reel because it was worth talking about. And it comes back to the populations that are now, this one is starting to get some attention in the literature. But when we look at the research again, it's all about, most of it is about sport. Like that's where concussion research started. That's the base of it. You look at the consensus in sport group, right? And it's talking about return to play after sport concussion, right? You look at the protocols that are out there, and it's all for return to learn after concussion and return to sport after concussion. But they're mostly looking at, still in the literature, sport injury. But one area that's getting more attention, which is great to see because it's different, is that around MVAs, motor vehicle accidents, because it's different. So I want to talk a little bit about what actually, there's research in this population now. Yay! Let's share a little bit about that. But then let's talk about why it's different. So, like I talked about, like Ontario does like all the research in Canada. So both of these studies actually came out of Ontario. One of the studies looked at the number of people with repeat car accidents after having a concussion versus having like an orthopedic injury of people who presented to the emergency department. Okay. What they found, and I bias this, or I state this with saying, I might have the exact percentage wrong, but it's around this number if it's not exactly it. But what they found was that individuals with an acute concussion were 49% more likely to have a second accident within the first month after that concussion compared to someone with an orthopedic injury. I don't know about you, but like, I think that's a pretty significant fucking number, right? 49% more likely to have a second car accident. And that could be driving into, that doesn't necessarily mean it involves another car, but a second accident within your vehicle within the first month after having a concussion. What do we do with this information? Like as a clinician, we actually had a conversation about in Concussion Nerds about the study in our monthly research review, because we're like, that's a significant number, right? But it's not 100. If it was 100%, we'd probably start revoking people's licenses for a month after concussion, but like, we're not going to do that, right? Stripping someone of their independence is the scariest thing ever. Why is this happening? Well, what this paper didn't do, which I think would be the next step to this study, which I would love to see, would be was there a prevalence of concussion profiles that were more likely to have this accident, right? So was it the individuals that had vestibular ocular challenges? Was it the individuals that had cervical challenges? Was it the individuals that had autonomic findings? Were they the individuals that were scoring really high on like cognitive or sleep deprivation? Who were those 49%? So because we know that concussion has those 7 profiles and that you don't need to fall into all 7. And so it could have been any of those. So that was, I'd say, the only like weak part. That was a weakness of this study is, okay, 49% of individuals had a secondary accident. But like, what do those 49% look like? We don't know. Okay. So I would love to know, was it a specific concussion profile that was more likely to be in the secondary accident? Because we know after concussion, we can have decreased spatial awareness, right? So you have decreased awareness of maybe recognizing where your car is in the environment, right? We have visual motion sensitivity, or we might have like stronger reactions or some PTSD. And so when someone's merging into a lane, are we jumping? And because we're turning our wheels, so we're bumping into someone over here, right? Are we slower to process things, or do we have collapsed peripheral vision so we're not seeing as much, right? Do we have a really stiff freaking neck so we can't shoulder check, so we're using our mirrors for everything, right? So I don't know what that 49% looks like. I think that would be the next level of a study like this. But the key is that there's 49% people are at 49% more likely to have a secondary car accident. And that's important, because then that's also saying it's not guaranteeing you'll have a second concussion, but what if they do have a secondary concussion on top of that first concussion? Well, now, and are we rescreening for that piece? So has someone been referred for that secondary concussion again? And is that being noted? Because we know that when you have that cumulative impact of one concussion on top of another one before one has healed, it's quite likely going to prolong your recovery, right? So that was a big thing. What else came out? The second piece was at a study. It was, again, I'm pretty sure it was done out of Toronto, that looked at the general population and recovery timelines. And they found that individuals after MVA, that the MVA itself was a risk factor for prolonged recovery. They also found that, I think it was 50% of those individuals went on to develop persistent symptoms. Now let's pause for a second and look at, again, they don't say why, but potentially part of that theory, if you just think of the last episode we talked about what happens when you deal with insurance companies and legality, right? I suspect that with MVAs, that's a factor on why recovery takes so much longer. Total, my own thoughts, not in the paper. But you're looking at like 50, I think it was 50% go on to develop persistent symptoms, and recovery timelines are 3 months or longer, right? And so now these are studies that are coming out directly from MVA. But now let's take a hot minute for a second and let's compare the protocol for sport concussion versus MVA concussion. Sport concussion was designed, not the concussion wasn't designed, but the protocols are designed, ideally, that when someone gets identified as having either a concussion or a suspected concussion, they are pulled off that field, pitch, ice, court, whatever it is. They are immediately connected with their team trainer, safety person, and screened for concussion. And should it be identified, they are entered into a concussion protocol. I realize this is best case scenario, but that world, they are then supported from the beginning with team, with physicians along the path to get them back to play. Okay. MVAs and concussions sustained from car accidents, or even the falls we talked about earlier in the episode, or all these things, they're not treated the same way. We're trying our damnedest as clinicians to advocate and make sure that you get that access too. But if you show up to the ER with an MVA, being recommended to see a physio or a chiro fully depends on the physician you see, because they don't all do it. I was literally just at a conference and someone had just said, I just recognize, like, Natasha, thank you for your presentation. I think I've been missing a lot of concussion. Not on purpose. They just don't know, right? So the MVA comes in, and that step one of like even you being referred to someone is dependent on the knowledge of the person who you're seeing. Then, who do you see? So ideally, you're given a specific recommendation and put into care. But maybe you're flying blind and you're just Googling things. Not every concussion clinician is equal, right? There's people who've done a weekend course who now say they're a concussion clinician. There's people who've done hours and hours and hours and hours and years of training who are concussion clinicians. We don't have a standard or an accreditation in any of our professions for you to look for. I'm trying to create that with concussion nerds, but anyways. And so now you have to get in to see somebody. Well, how quickly you get in to see somebody depends on A, when you recognize and need that referral. B, what is the wait list like at that clinic? What is their process for getting you in? Then you get in and then you start the process. But like we've talked about with sport, there's, I shouldn't say there's no trauma, but like you don't have the litigation stuff usually. You don't have like those pieces of things versus an MVA, depending on the incident itself, like is there some traumatic pieces that are now also impacting? Like now we like what's happening with life, with home. And so the process, the system wasn't built to efficiently and effectively treat a concussion from an MVA. It just wasn't. The stats work against you still. They're now becoming more clear, thank God, because it's not being directly compared to a sport injury. But the timelines and who you see and how quickly you see them really kind of depends on your initial knowledge and the initial knowledge of the person you saw in the emergency department. And so what we need to be doing is having this awareness of more like that this process needs to happen more fluidly. It needs to happen faster. And with an MVA, if you have a concussion, you also most likely have whiplash. So you're already dealing with compounding profile, like multiple profiles that need that recovery and healing. So it's just this piece of a little bit of an awareness with this like really short and sweet episode of the system. When you look at concussion protocols today, so many of them still are built around sport. So many are built around sport. And we need to do a better job in extrapolating protocols towards the general public. I'm saying the word protocol. You all know I don't believe in black and white check boxes. I don't think you can have a checklist, but you can have frameworks that you move through. But step one is always get into a provider who's able to do that multi-level, multi-systems assessment and support you in that process to help guide you with the teams that you need to bring in. 49% have a secondary car accident. What do we do with that information? Right? I think for us, and in the clinic, and when we talked about this in Nerds, it's not that we were going to take people's licenses away. We can't anyways. But I think it's an important discussion to have with our clients. And maybe the client makes the choice to not drive for the first couple weeks. You know, many people do make that decision on their own anyways. They're like, I just don't feel safe behind the wheel. But like maybe we actually need to be having that discussion of, you know, like everything else is harder. We actually have research now to show like you are at an increased risk for another car accident, a higher increased risk for another car accident just in this first month. And let the client make the decision. But I think the question for clinicians is, are we ethically informed to share that information so that the client can make that decision? Because we realized in Nerds, you know, we educate on return to learn, we educate on returning to activities. And we realized not because we weren't doing it, but we weren't educating on driving or returning to driving. And so this study made us really pause and think about, okay, maybe this is something we need to be talking about. And we're never trying to do anything to scare our clients. That's not it. But they need to be informed. And they need to be aware of the risk to make that decision for themselves. And so for us, it was kind of this piece of, you know what, this should probably just be a piece that we layer into education when an acute concussion client comes through our door. And this piece of, while it's not a guarantee, the research is now showing us that MVAs typically have a longer recovery trajectory. And I think it's just where this kind of highlights more this, when the Falls episode we talked to, is that up to this point, or I'm going to say the last few years, because I started seeing research come out more around 2023 on some of these separate kind of areas. So much of what we've based our concussion knowledge on has truly been sport. And now we're starting to see research come out in these diverse, different subpopulations and categories. And I think it's important because we can't directly compare everything to sport and to men as well as we're learning. So just a little highlight for that person. So if you are the MVA person, you've been in a car accident, this is taking longer, you're feeling frustrated, you know, and I hate to say it, it's normal. Doesn't mean it's good, but know that you're not alone in that process and that, you know, that awareness is now coming to the point that I think if you're actually a clinician or a GP listening to this, if someone's had an MVA, can you just refer them? Can we just refer them for a proper screening and assessment to ensure that their brains are healthy? All right, my friends, have an amazing day. We'll talk to you soon.